This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome members and officers here at City Hall and the public in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee. Please may I remind participants to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members to ensure that any electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Can I ask the clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We've got apologies for absence from Assembly Member Pigeon, for whom Assembly Member Bakari is a substitute.
Thank you. And I think Assembly Member Baker will be with us shortly. Declarations of interest. Can we...
Yeah. Can I say, I know my role as Statutory Deputy Mayor is already on the papers, but given with regards to item 5, I should declare that in my capacity as Statutory Deputy Mayor, I have undertaken to travel to some meetings of the European capital mayors when the mayor has been unavailable.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member McCartney. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I ask also, ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda, which I don't believe is pecuniary, is it? Yes. Yeah.
We don't. Enough having to get here, Chair.
Noted.
Should we be allowed to fly? What do you think?
Perhaps we can pick that. Perhaps members can pick that up in questions. Moving on to the minutes, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 24th of May 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much. Summary list of actions. Can we note the completed, closed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the GLA Oversight Committee? Thank you. And moving on to the main item of business today, GLA domestic and international trips. We now move the principal business, which I'd like to welcome our invited guests who have joined us for this discussion. And we'd also, I think, all the committee like to extend a congratulations to David Bellamy, who has received the Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the King's Birthday Honours List.
Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome, and many congratulations. We are also joined by Mary Hartley, Chief Officer, and I should say David Bellamy is also the Chief of Staff for the GLA. Enver, the Acting Chief and Finance Officer and Director, and Philip Graham, the Executive Director of Good Growth GLA. We had hoped to get the Mayor's Director of Operations, Ali Picton, here today, but unfortunately not. So hopefully, David, you will be able to cover those questions. Right, I'm going to leap in straight away, and this is to everyone on the panel. What are the key potential benefits and disadvantages the GLA assesses when undertaking domestic and international trips?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Clearly, the purpose of any travel undertaken by the GLA is, as with other expenditure and other activities, is tied back to the purposes of the GLA. Principally the general powers set out in Section 30 of the Act in terms of promoting the economic development and wealth creation in Greater London, the social development in Greater London, or improvement of environment. And as the committee will be aware, there are other subsidiary duties on the GLA, for instance, promoting tourism into London. And so all the GLA activity, and travel would be no exception, would fall into that category. And obviously the benefits will flow from the specifics of the matter in question that's led to the travel. In terms of costs, well, they probably would fall into two categories. First is obviously financial costs associated with the trip, where those are borne by the GLA, because in many cases actually they're borne by the people we've been invited to visit, and thus are at no cost to the GLA. Secondly would be, as with all activities, whether they're undertaken in this building or anywhere else, there would be the issue of opportunity cost.
Thanks, David. So when you're looking at the potential benefits and disadvantages, I didn't hear you mention the environment at all. Is that not a consideration that's currently made?
So, Chair, as you'll know from the policy, we have an offsetting policy which is carried out for all air travel, and I know there are some rightly concerns about some carbon offsetting schemes in use, but we believe the GLA is the one we use is strong and effective, and so that mitigates that concern.
We also have policies in place regarding the use of rail travel wherever possible, and the policies specifically mention Paris and Brussels in terms of international travel, but in practice we use rail often for trips rather further afield than that, where it's feasible to do so.
Thank you. Did anybody else on the panel want to come in on some of the benefits or disadvantages that are looked at?
I mean, I can talk a little in terms of the benefits of staff, of travel undertaken by staff, particularly within Good Growth, but I think this applies to to some other teams as well. I mean, I would say there are three predominant reasons for which staff within Good Growth travel overseas. One of which is around supporting the Mayor's work on economic growth and investment. So that has included supporting trips that the Mayor himself has undertaken, but also also supporting wider activity led by LNP and by others to continue to promote economic growth, seek investment in London, and so on. Alongside that, we are part of a number of international fora, wherever, in most cases, we engage with those forums remotely, but there are occasional meetings and conferences and so on where it's important for the GLA to have a presence there, to set the agenda, to make sure that we are informing and influencing the work of those groups. I think the C40 is a good example of that. And then finally, there is opportunities to learn from experience in other cities, to talk about best practice in London, but particularly to bring back best practice from other places. And in those cases, again, you can do some of that remotely, but there are real benefits from meeting people face to face and seeing what has happened in real life and in the flesh.
So on the flip side of that, Philip, what considerations would you make when perhaps turning down an opportunity to travel? I
mean, exactly the same considerations that David has made. Clearly, there is an environmental consideration, as you have identified. But I think, generally speaking, where travel is in compliance with or sort of goes beyond the GLA's policies in terms of the environment, we would be supportive. But there is an opportunity cost in terms of time away from the office. People can continue to work while on international travel, but a big proportion of their time is going to be taken up with those wider conversations. And clearly, to some degree, there is a cost implication. So we would think about whether the costs of travel are justified. Clearly, that applies less where those costs are funded by external organisations. That doesn't apply in the same way where those costs are funded by external organisations. But we would still want to know that the benefits outweigh the impacts in terms of sort of time and staff availability for other matters.
Thanks, Philip. Enver, how much money has the GLA spent on trips over the last few years, and how has this spend changed over time?
Morning, Chair. I'll give you the exact numbers. So it's not massive in the grand scheme of the GLA budget. So the expenditure total was just over 800 million last year. The spend on travel was just over 100,000 last year. The 2 years before that was, I'm just scrolling down to actually give you the exact numbers, so bear with me a second while I find the right sheet.
Ember, would it be possible, just for my brain to work better, to give me the financial year alongside that, the figures?
Yeah, so if we go to 18-19 financial year, the total spend, according to the ledger, was 163,000. The 19-20 year, the total spend was 77,000. The 2021 year was 25,000. 21-22 was 70.
It's 28,982.
Your eyesight's better than mine, David. Yeah, it's 28, and then 103 in last year. And in the 2021 year, there was no international. So in that, the figure that I gave you, there was none of that was international. In 2021, so it was all domestic. And I'm assuming it was domestic before lockdown, so because I wasn't expecting to see any there, but I'm guessing it was just before lockdown.
Thanks, Ember. I'd just like to bring in Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So, Ember, what has been the total environmental impact of the GLA's trips over the last few years, and how has this impact changed over time?
I can't answer the impact question. So the company that is used to record the travel is Agito, and part of the contract is that they do the carbon offsetting, but I haven't got the carbon offsetting figures to hand, but I can look that up and come back to you.
That would be very helpful.
In terms of cost, I mean, it looks like there's a bit of catch-up in 22-23, but it's less than it was if you take the 18-19 year as the proper full year pre-pandemic. Mm-hmm. It's significantly less than that year. So from a cost point of view, it has come down. And if you look at the fact that there's a lot more sort of online facility, I think there's a lot more meetings that take place without requiring travel. The number of trips have come down, but there are still some trips.
Yeah, I was absolutely going to just say, do you think that the pandemic has actually enabled people to use international travel less because it's possible to do a lot of that engagement in terms of online meetings? To an extent,
but I mean, as we've described before, I mean, I went to an event that was for 4 days. I couldn't have stayed online for 4 days. You know, there's an attention span, mm-hmm. and the repertoire you pick up with other cities around the world in between those focus points and meeting them and then bringing that knowledge back. So, you know, from my own personal experience, that climate budgeting that you've all recognised before, that came off the back of an international trip to Oslo, which first of all I was quite surprised that they were actually making us fly, but it did pay for itself by being there and making that contact. And in September we host, so they come to us.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose you're making the case for face-to-face meetings because that does make a difference when you're trying to engage with people.
Does. And it's hard when you're in another city for somebody to walk around with a laptop showing it to you. I mean, if you're there and you're talking to people and they're explaining what they're doing, and then they come back to our city and we show them what we do, you can't really do that online for a sustained period. It's not the same as dialing into a 2 or 3 hour meeting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I guess it's the same reason, isn't it, why we have offices, in that we recognise that, while it's possible to some extent to work from home, and for some tasks, that can be quite effective, when it comes to interaction and building relationships, just as human beings, that is much better done in person. And when you get those relationships, that makes it more possible to do that online interaction, and thus hence the GLA's hybrid approach to office working, and I think you probably see something similar in terms of the impact on travel.
Mm-hmm. So my next question is for Mary. Does the GLA publish its rationale for undertaking international trips or flights when public transport or virtual attendance options are available? So is there a rationale published?
No, I don't believe we publish them. We think through the rationale, as you've heard people talk about, but it's not published.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you might given that the use of, given that in terms of the climate crisis, everyone is really thinking about how to reduce carbon emissions from travel, and it's not just about offsetting, it is actually about there being fewer emissions from international travel. Do you think you might think about publishing a rationale so that that's clear and transparent?
So I think we probably should think about it. I mean, in preparing for this panel and putting together all the information that has been asked for and that we've gathered, I think a few things have struck us about this data and how we use it, and so I think what we want to do is reflect after this meeting and see what we might do differently.
Thank you.
And that might be one example, but I think that there may be others that come up too. Okay,
well, that would be very useful to understand that. David, in May 2022, the Mayor, 2 Deputy Mayors and 8 GLA officers took a 5-day trip to the US. Now, the cost of the flights was over £32,000, and it was paid for by United Airlines following a partnership agreement which reduced the GLA costs to $2,800 of taxes and fees. So that looks like a great deal, but what did United Airlines get in return?
I'll be honest, I'm not cited. My understanding was that, we approached them and looked for, looking for a group booking in the way that any group travel arrangement could. Obviously, it's not just about the travel of the mayor and the GLA party. There's also some members of the media travel on these bigger trips, and so we were able to negotiate that. I'm not aware of anything specifically we did for them in exchange.
A note in the mayor's press release about the trip, which says, and I'm quoting, United Airlines is proud to be flying the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and his team on their trade mission to the United States. United Airlines is set to operate 22 flights per day from London Heathrow to the United States for summer 2022. So it kind of looks like it was a United Airlines sponsored trip.
So I wouldn't describe it as a United Airlines sponsored trip. What I would say is that in the nature of any mayoral trip, we're dealing with a number of businesses and organisations and helping them do business with London. So, on that trip, for example, Major League Baseball. And so clearly the mayor was promoting Major League Baseball, and the fixtures, obviously we've got the first one coming up in London this weekend. And so it's a natural part of these trips that businesses doing business with London get some publicity out of it, and that to me seems like just like one example where clearly United Airlines post-pandemic have increased the service that they provide between London and the US. So
are you saying that there's no partnership agreement with United Airlines?
I'm not saying anything specific because I wasn't involved in it and don't have the facts. But there's no ongoing relationship that I'm aware of. It's specifically was an announcement made about that time where United Airlines clearly were looking to promote their increased service.
If you could take away finding out whether there was any kind of partnership arrangement,
we do that
and
in
if
the
so,
usual way.
please publish it.
Happy to.
Thank you. Now, the mayor's team of 11 flew business class from London to New York, then to San Francisco. The group then flew from San Francisco to Los Angeles, a journey shorter than London to Edinburgh, and then business class again from LA to London. Now, I've calculated the approximate emissions of that trip, and it's a total of 64 tonnes of CO2, which is equivalent to nearly 20 times the climate footprint that most Londoners manage in a whole year. So in just 5 days, and without counting the 11 UK journalists who travelled alongside them, and that was apparently to promote UK-US tourism, which is also about more flights, predominantly taken by people who fly very frequently. So David and Mary, and Mary as authorising officer of the mayor's expenses claims, do you think that can be justified in a climate emergency?
Yeah, I think it's clearly the case that as part of the move to net zero, there will need to be changes to all sectors of travel. We know that I think as a base matter of engineering and science that changes to aviation is the most probably the most challenging area, but nonetheless it's happening. I know, for instance, that one of the trips the mayor's been on was done with sustainable aviation fuels, and it was an opportunity to promote that and encourage that. And so, it is difficult. One can take a view, of course, that any form of air travel is unacceptable in the current situation, but clearly that isn't the position of the mayor, and clearly the economic impact of adopting such an approach on London and Londoners' livelihoods would be very significant.
Thank you. I've just got one final question for Enver. In practice, how does the GLA apply its framework to determine whether an alternative mode of transport to flying is practical and available? And how does the GLA ensure it applies this framework, this aspect of the framework, consistently and fairly?
The guidance is public, so it does tell every individual what they need to consider before making a decision. The line manager who would authorise it would have to ensure that the officer who's travelling has justified that, and depending on the seniority of the person travelling, it would escalate up to CMT level, and that individual would still check that. So when it's being signed, the person who's authorising is effectively saying, I've had this conversation and I've agreed this under the terms of the policy. So whilst I don't know every single trip, the individual who's authorising it should be ensuring that compliance with the policy is there, and the form to travel abroad has to justify what mode of transport is being used. So the default should not be air, especially for internal flights. There should be a question about, is travel needed in the first place? But if the travel is needed, is it the most economic way to get there? And the policy does say, you could take a bus, you could cycle. So the policy is quite up to date from that point of view. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it does reflect on the environmental impact of it. And there's always the balance between the value for money from a financial point of view, value for money from an environment point of view. If it takes somebody many hours to travel via another route, there's still the cost of the person getting there and how long they're taking to get there as well. So all of those factors need to be considered.
I'm just about to hand back to the chair, but I think that then raises the question, when you have a sponsorship deal where the actual material cost, or a kind of a deal of cheap flights with an airline company, were those decisions applied, particularly for, there was one of the flights that was a distance shorter than London to Edinburgh, and were those tests applied in that case?
Well, I mean, I can answer directly in terms of, I apply those tests when I look at travel from members of the Mayor's office, and what you have to look at for that trip is you have to look at, like you're saying, you're talking about a journey between San Francisco and Los Angeles. Firstly, one has to reflect that the United States is a very different place to this country in terms of rail infrastructure. And the options that we have in this country, and one has, for instance, going to continental Europe, are not, in general, options that you get in the United States. I speak there as somebody who, in my previous role, used to regularly take a train between Boston and New York, so I'm familiar with the US rail network. The other factor, of course, is the schedule, and the itinerary for that trip was packed, doesn't begin to describe it, and so it's also the elapsed time is a very important consideration.
Thank you. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thanks. I just wanted to briefly come back, David, to those questions Assembly Member Russell was asking about the relationship with the plane provider in that trip, and you were saying you weren't clear on the detail. That's exactly why we had tried as a committee to ask Ali Picton to come, because we thought as a Director of Operations she would be closer to that detail, and we were assured you would know the detail. So who is the person that possesses that detail that should be here?
So the actual arrangements for international travel would be done through the GLA's international relations team. And so they would be, because as discussed, that trip involved the Mayor, a number of mayors of the Mayor's office, a couple of colleagues from other teams, and obviously external media, and so they would take on the organisation of that trip. And they're, in terms of reporting lines, they're within the Strategy and Communications Directorate.
Okay, so who do you think you should have? So we should have had the comms director then.
So the executive director for Strategy and Comms is Nira Mutada.
Right, so it would have been helpful perhaps to suggest that, because we come to a situation then where we're in this meeting and we're not getting all the facts that we wanted in that meeting.
Chair, to be very frank, if I'd known you were going to ask about this specific topic, well, either I could have suggested that Niran attend, or I would have found out more detail on it myself and answered it. with respect, sometimes it's very difficult to sit this side of the room and anticipate what's going to be asked, and we put quite a bit of time into preparing and trying to anticipate what questions we will get with very little information about that, what that might be, and more briefing and insight from the committee about what you'd want to talk about will enable us to be either better prepared or to ensure we've got the right people in front of you.
No, I am sorry that it came as a surprise we were questioning the America trip when we were looking at overseas trips, one of the biggest trips the Mayor's had in the last year. So, but I'll pass over to Assembly Member Fortune, wanted to come in.
Thank you very much. It was just quickly to pick up on what Caroline Russell was asking about the sponsored trips. And by the way, I don't actually have an issue with the Mayor of London going around and visiting other countries. I think it's important. Well, you'll do it when you're Mayor, I'm sure,
will.
Susan.
I will.
So the look of fear that went over Mary's face there was fantastic. But when you have sponsored or paid for trips, who owns that carbon footprint?
Sorry, I think you might be I think you might be confusing two things. We don't. So, sponsor. If you're meaning a trip in which, so somebody, is invited, let's say, by another city government to go and visit that city, and they want, they want us there, they want our expertise, they pay for, therefore agree to pay for the cost of travel. Well, that then would sit with them because they would have the responsibility for the decision making. If it's a case, and this is where it can get complicated sometimes, is in terms of the transparency and things that would go to audit panel, is they may very well say, well, we'll pay for it, but can you book it? Yeah, and then we'll pay you back. And if that happens, then the GLA approaches the booking in terms of its policies and the environmental impact and the offsetting in exactly the same way we would as if the GLA was paying itself.
So I don't think I have confused the question then. So if we're paying for it, we will own that carbon footprint. If the Mayor is travelling, or anyone in the Mayor's team, I'm not having a go, I'm just trying to work out the way it's audited. So if a trip is paid for by somebody else, that won't add on to the balance of the carbon footprint of the Mayor, for example. So it's not a cumulative process in terms of carbon footprint.
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm saying, if it comes through the GLA, the GLA's offsetting approach will apply. Yeah, I'm not quite following you in terms of beyond that, because we'll obviously we'll report about the trips, but I don't quite get the point about ownership at it.
So let's say the United Airlines trip was funded by United Airlines, yeah. That wasn't booked through the mayoral agency or the travel agency, was it?
No, I mean it was a group booking, so it probably.
So there's a big old size 9 carbon footprint that goes with the flights over to the States. Would that cumulatively go on the bottom line of the carbon footprint created by the Mayor and the team, or because it's paid for somewhere else, does it not come on our books, as it were?
So we would report the air miles. Indeed, I've got in front of me the air miles figure for that trip. I would have to ask officers about how that ties in with any carbon footprint reporting. Right. I'm not cited.
So that's the question. So hypothetically speaking, let's say there's one trip next year, and it's a trip to China. If it's booked by the GLA, the carbon footprint created by that trip will go onto a ledger somewhere as the carbon footprint. However, if that trip is paid for by an external company, China Airways, whoever, then the carbon footprint would be 0 because it hasn't gone through our accounting system.
Well, if it was, it's about where it was booked. If we booked it and then somebody else paid for it, well, then it would come through our systems. It would come out in our reporting. Yeah. The question is, right, if it's not coming through GLA systems, well, do we then get the carbon information to include in our reporting? And the answer is, I don't know.
Okay. So I think that might be worth going and have a look at, because that'll give us a true reflection of the footprint that's being created, especially for big trips like to the States, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. Excellent questioning from my colleague next to me, because I was actually going to ask very similar questions. But I do want to talk a little bit more about these external funded trips. David, can you just give me a little bit of understanding of other funders, people who funded other trips to do, doesn't necessarily have to be abroad, but has anyone ever from other companies funded trips for us other than United Airlines?
So I think, start with full transparency. I once was asked to go and speak at the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives Conference in Manchester, and part of the cost of going up to Manchester to do that they paid, and partly the GLA picked up. So that would be one example. Another example would be some costs are picked up, for instance, by C40, where certainly where the Mayor travels as chair of C40, they would pick up that cost, and then I'm not familiar, but it's possible that some of the costs in terms of the GLA's membership of C40 may give us some travel to some of their events. Similarly, arrangements like that for the World Cities Cultural Forum, and then there will be other examples of that where it would be the particular city or event that a member of staff is visiting, that they would pick up the cost of the travel.
Why do they agree to pay for these trips? What's their reasoning?
Because they want, in general, because they want to learn from London's experience and the things we've achieved.
Do they have their name mentioned in any publications, or is there maybe a banner anywhere in any rooms, or any publicity at all with any of these companies that paid for trips?
We're not really talking about companies here. We're talking about organisations, public sector and third sector, and the publicity flows because they've got a member of GLA staff on stage at the event.
And is this all publicly available, all of the ways that they've been funded, all these trips, easily accessible, transparent?
Yes, because all members of staff and elected members as well, I would add, need to complete a gift and hospitality form. So if somebody offers them to pay for their travel to come and speak at an event, for example, then they would complete that form, and then those are reported through to the audit panel under the established arrangements. And for mayoral appointees, senior staff, those gifts and hospitalities are declared on their pages on our website.
Okay, brilliant. Can you tell me a little bit about why the Mayor's Director of Political and Public Affairs needed to attend the Durham Miners Gala in 2022-23? Does he go every year?
She.
Oh, she, sorry.
No, I believe that's a one-off, but it was an opportunity to meet with a number of important stakeholders who were gathered there, and so it was a very useful thing to do that after a period, of course, in which a lot of in-person meetings hadn't been happening for obvious reasons.
So the Durham Miners Gala was an important event to go to for the Mayor and the work of the Mayor.
So the Mayor didn't attend. It was.
But it was for.
So it was. It's for the Mayor, and it was an important opportunity to meet with senior figures from a number of the trade unions that the Mayor deals with, both in his role as an employer and in terms of
I'm just trying to see the connection with London, though.
Well,
London and miners.
I was trying to answer that. So, as I was saying, both unions the Mayor deals with in his role as an employer, and also unions the Mayor deals with in their representative role for millions of Londoners who work in this city. Durham Miners Gala, as it happens in a personal capacity, I was in Durham on Friday, is probably the lead-in event outside the TUC Congress annual meeting where members of the Labour movement gather together, and so in that context it was an opportunity for a lot of meetings to be held that were needed, as I say, after a period in the pandemic when in-person meetings couldn't happen.
Okay, and you can perhaps give us an evaluation of that meeting, what's going to happen out of that as a result, the next steps. Is that something that you can share with us?
I'm not going to get into a world where we try and do that for about every single bit of travel that goes on. In this specific instance, I probably couldn't give you a detailed readout because the Mayoral Director concerned on maternity leave, so clearly I can't speak to her to get the details we're after.
Okay. I mean, Enver, when I was reading through the notes, it was very clear that there's always got to be a thinking process of before we do anything when we're spending money, public money, that we think, is it worth spending the money? This is public money, and the use of this money has to be carefully thought about. Now, I've all my colleagues know this. I've been a teacher for years, and I was paid by public money, and every time we ran out of pencils and felt tips and paper, I spent my money, my wages, and never asked the school for any money because I knew that they were strapped for cash. Lots of teachers are doing that right now. Do you think that it's enough for us to have that kind of premise before we spend money to think it's public money? Because at the end of the day, if we thought about it in a more personal level, this is my wage, would you spend that money? Do you think we're doing enough when we're thinking about our thought processes about spending the money?
I think everyone that works in the public sector should be thinking like that in everything that they do. The rigour that goes into every decision is what I said before. It should be justified between the individual before they even ask for it. The manager should make them really prove that, and that discussion should be documented when the approval is made. I can't say when we're working through this process that
Sorry, I think it might be a mic, but it sounds like there's a stomping dinosaur or something here. I don't know. Maybe the feedback.
It could be me.
Yes, that might be it. Was that just me? I could hear
It's my breathing.
Okay, it was. Sorry.
I thought it was thunder. Go for it.
I'm not quite sure what more I can say. I genuinely think if it's public money, we need to be considering it. We're not awash with public money, and every trip needs to be justified. But Mr. Bellamy's explained what he knows about individual specific trips, and there's 5 years of trips here that we've been looking at, and I'm assuming that the right checks and balances were done before each of those trips did take place.
Any mayor, any deputy mayor ever said, you know what, I think I'll spend my own wages on this trip because I think it's quite expensive, so I'll do that instead. Has that ever happened?
I think if we go down that path, Assembly Member, we end up in a world in which people are expected to do their jobs for free, and we end up back in the situation we were in Parliament in the early part of the 20th century, where Parliament was only open to those who could independently support themselves. It is the right and professional thing to do that if a trip is needed for the benefit of Londoners, for the reasons the GLA was established, that the GLA should fund it in just the same way as the GLA would do other expenses. And I remind you that the total expenditure incurred last year on travel is 0.1% of the GLA's income. So in 1,000th of 1%. So I think we can be clear that this is is a very limited expenditure. I think we have transparency arrangements about it. We have a review of the policy coming up as a scheduled review next spring, and so it's a good opportunity for us to think about what can be done better, but we need to keep this in a sense of proportion.
Thank you.
Thanks. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. I'm just again looking at the Director for Political and Public Affairs. I can understand why he might want to, and we should fund him going to the Olympic Cities meeting.
Her,
and also, I can actually understand why we funded her to go to Liverpool for the Labour Party conference. Not that I'd choose to go to either myself, but where it digs a bit is the Champions League final. Now that has to be a jolly. That just has to be a jolly. And I would have thought that if I'd had the privilege of being invited to the Champions League final, I would have funded that trip myself.
So one of the responsibilities that post holder holds, Assembly Member, is for major sporting events and bringing those to London. And as you will know, the Champions League final is in London next year. And so in that context, arrangements with UEFA and indeed previous host cities to get that learning are absolutely critical. It is now the third biggest sporting event in the world, that final, after fourth after the Olympics and the two of the UEFA European Championships and obviously the World Cup. It is a huge event that we will be staging next year, and it's absolutely right that we take every opportunity to look at how the event is staged, the arrangements around it, and have those relationships with UEFA and the host city, because the event next June will absolutely see all of Europe and indeed people all around the world with their eyes on London. There'll be a great number of people, both with tickets and without tickets, visiting the city, and it's a really, really significant undertaking for the GLA, and one we've got to get right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And David, did you have any more information around the Mayor's diary on that time that perhaps you could send as a committee afterwards? Obviously, take the point around the learning that was done there. So
sorry, we weren't talking about the Mayor there. We were talking about the Mayoral Director for Political and Public Affairs.
The Mayoral Director at the Champions League final. If we could have some of the engagements.
I'll see what I can do. As I noted earlier, she's on maternity leave, so it's a question of what records we can access in her absence.
Thanks. Assembly Member Hall.
Okay, thank you. There's always questions about trips. I actually think that the Mayor should be out there selling London. That's part of his job. So I haven't got a problem with that personally, but there are always questions about trips and how they've been paid for and all the rest of it. But the GLA provides, whilst it provides cost breakdowns of trips, when you're responding to individual freedom of information requests, there's no single online repository that anybody could go to. And I think, bearing in mind that the Mayor said he was going to be the most transparent Mayor ever, which has been a joke in itself, but do you not think it would be more sensible if all of these trips were put in one place? And to go back to Assembly Member Russell's point, a reason for why somebody else is paying for that trip, because then it would clear all this up just by being online. And it would be interesting to know why other people are paying for things if it's not obvious for the Mayor.
So the trips are obviously reported to the audit for the Mayor and senior staff are reported to the audit panel regularly, and that's obviously public. All the gifts and hospitality information is public. I think I am right in saying I'm trying to look over your head and catch the eye of the monitoring officer, that there actually is a web page that pulls together all the gift and hospitality information into one place. If not, we can certainly look at that. A reflection from me would be that the GLA invested a lot in its kind of systems and processes in its early days, and we recognise the need to modernise those now. The committee will be aware of the establishment of the Digital Experience Unit, and part of that is about the internal processes we follow. And hopefully, as we improve those processes, which obviously includes things like approvals around travel, we can look at that in terms of the range of information that we can generate, because of course what we need to be mindful of is ensuring we're generating information that is useful to those interested in it, rather than just a big data dump, and also that it is proportionate in terms of the effort required to produce it, recognising that that has a cost to the taxpayer as well.
Yeah, I accept that, but equally, when you say you're going to be the most transparent person ever, I'm afraid that's a cost implication to your pledge, isn't it? And it was a pledge, and pledges have to be costed up and then delivered upon, and we're constantly bringing this up, and will constantly bring it up, I imagine. Last month I submitted mayoral questions, which I'm yet to receive answers to, on the Deputy Mayor for Business's 4-day trade mission to India and the Night Tsar's visit to Sydney, Australia. Can you provide me with an update on these, including costs, internal and externals, KPIs and carbon footprint?
Okay, well, probably trying to answer all that in detail probably needs to be done in writing.
Yes, please.
The Deputy Mayor's trip you're talking about was an L&P trip, so I don't have details about that in front of me. I do have the approval form for the NITSA and her trip to Australia, which was at the request and funded by the Government of New South Wales.
That's interesting. I wonder why they would want that. That will, no doubt, it will emerge, and if you send me some of the details, we can no doubt ask you questions another time. So, what are the GLA's main reasons for rejecting trip proposals, and what do you think is the impact of you not taking them up? So, I know earlier, Mary, you said you gave everything great thought, but your great thought isn't written down anywhere, so we don't know what your great thought is. So, why would you reject a trip proposal?
Actually, I'm going to ask Phil to answer that, if that's okay, because it's the executive directors who are essentially making those decisions.
Essentially, for the reasons that we have previously discussed, that that we either think the environmental impact, particularly where it's short haul, where it would require a short haul flight or a long haul flight, aren't justified by the benefits to London or to Londoners, or where we don't actually think that the information that would be gathered or the connections that might be made would be sufficiently valuable to justify the time away from other duties. I mean, it has to be said, I mean, certainly from my perspective in good growth, London is a regional authority with it, and there is a lot more travel to other parts, from City Hall to other parts of the capital, to cement those relationships on the tube and so on and so forth, than there is internationally, or even to other parts of the UK. So, the bar has been set very high for people, pretty high for people to come to me to ask for permission, because we are very much focused on our role within London. But generally speaking, I do look at those carefully, because the bar is set very high. In most cases, the justification is well made, but there have been one or two occasions where we've decided that it isn't the best use of time or money, or indeed the GLA's, or the environmental impact perhaps isn't justified.
It's interesting you say most of the trips are made around London. It begs the question why the Mayor put us here in one of the most inaccessible places in London you could hope to or dread to go to. But if you're looking then at the Night Tsar's visit to Sydney, that was absolutely justified, was it? Regardless of anybody else paying for it, whatever carbon footprint that caused.
Well, yeah, I think it was. I mean, I think, there's a genuine value for London, particularly in terms of it continuing to be seen as sort of a magnet for tourism, for investment, for talent, for being seen to be leading the world in some of these areas around the nighttime economy, around its culture and creative industries, and so on. And so both being able to promote London's position internationally, but also learn from best practice in other parts of the world seems to me a valuable thing for us to be doing. And I think, cementing London's position at the forefront of work on the 24-hour economy is exactly what I think the Night Tsar was trying to do through that travel.
Well, I give you something definitely does need to be done, but we will wait and see if anything comes of it, won't we? Mary, have you had to approve international travel expenses from the Mayor, Statutory Deputy Mayor and Executive Officers, as you've had to? Can you confirm if you've ever rejected a claim from the Mayor? Have you ever told him he can't go somewhere?
No.
No. Could you provide the committee with a breakdown of all the... oh, you said you haven't, though. Well, I'll leave it at that. You've never said no to him at all. Could the GLA routinely publish a full list of all the GLA trips covering the purpose, total cost and impact of each trip? And it's more the impact that we're interested in.
So I think, as I said to Assemblymember Russell earlier on in the meeting, we're doing two things. We're considering the work we have had to do to pull all this information together for today, because the information, as you observed, doesn't all sit in one place. We wanted to hear the thoughts of the committee in terms of your response to some of this information. As David has said, the benefits framework is up for review next April anyway. That comes up every 2 years. And we also, I think, just need to reflect on the environmental impact of some of this. And I think the challenge from Assemblymember Russell about, how hard do we test those choices about trips and how trips are made. What I want to do is take all of this reflection away, and then we'll work out. I think, as David has said, there is a balance between what more work we should do to make some of this information easier to find, because it would have been good for us if some of it had been easier to find in preparation for today, but also balance that with the effort needed to do that for the value it provides. Yeah. But I think we are listening to what you were saying, and we've got our own reflections based on our preparation for this event.
Yes, you see, I was mentioning it all being in one place, and David was suggesting that it was, and you're saying it took you ages to get all the information together to give us answers. That's exactly where I was coming from.
I think we were referring to two slightly different aspects of information there.
Well, if it was all available, it would be so much easier, and you probably wouldn't have needed this meeting. Some of the travel expenses only seems to show the details of journeys one way. Why was the return journey for all those trips not added?
I think we might have to look at individual examples to answer that.
The information we supplied, Jack, can you hear me? The information that we supplied did come from the system, so if someone's booked a return trip, it should be on there, whether it was clear from the data download that it was a return trip. I'm not sure, but it, sometimes one line referred to the return booking, so it was one booking. Sometimes there were two separate bookings, so it's two
I'll look
lines.
into that and send you the
we all know,
details.
don't we, from our experience of booking train travel for ourselves, that sometimes you buy two single tickets and sometimes you buy a return, and so it may just be how the system feeds that through.
Exactly.
Okay, well, if there's something that looks not right, we'll send it to you and perhaps you'll answer us separately. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. It's just a sort of very short follow-up about the quality of the data, and just noticed that some of the descriptions, most of them do say where the trip was to, which kind of provides some context, but there's one that's just recorded as site visit, another one conference attendance, and so when you're doing your review of how this data is collected, so it's easy for you to keep track of what's going on, it would be good to make sure that that kind of transparency is properly picked up. Is that something you can pick up on that?
Yeah, that sounds very sensible.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I've just had an indication that we welcome some more information on the carbon offsetting procedures and process. But I wondered just quickly if anyone on the panel knows how are we offsetting our carbon?
I don't have the details of that. I mean, I'm aware, as David said, that we have looked carefully at different offsetting systems and have sought to choose an offset provider who we think provides it meets the criteria for an effective offsetting scheme. But I would need to come back to you with exactly who the provider is, with Enver's support and how and what particular offsetting mechanisms they use.
We purchase our credits from Carbon Footprint Limited. That's all I've got here. But again, we can probably provide some more.
Yeah, I asked our TfL procurement team when the current contract was awarded to the operator, Agito, how that works. So I'm just looking at for the contract, so maybe I can share that with you, because that should detail the carbon offsetting, what they agreed as part of that.
Please, is it?
I'm just concerned about that because I often hear we're offsetting our footprint and all the rest of it, and I just assumed you knew exactly how you were offsetting it. Because it's so easy to say, oh, we're offsetting our we're flying here, there and everywhere else to talk about the environment. I mean, everybody seems to be flying off somewhere to talk about the environment, and then they say, and we're offsetting our footprint. And I'm Assembly Member Russell would know where all those offsettings go, but I would absolutely expect you two, Phil, to know exactly where it goes, because it's churned out by all of you so often. Oh yes, we're offsetting that. Well, to where? To what? I'm just looking at blank faces. I'm just, to be honest with you, it's something I thought earlier, and I thought I'm going to look ridiculous asking that because everybody's talking about their offsetting of their carbon footprint all the time. And I thought to myself earlier, I should know the answer to that, not dreaming that nobody on the panel knew the answer to that. I'm astonished.
I think that so it's entirely integrated. The delivery of that is integrated into our Agito contract. Ember, isn't it? That's the point.
Thanks. Assembly Member Russell, I mean, Assembly Member Hall's made quite a bold statement that you know where all the offset carbon in the world's going. So are you going to tell us that now?
I certainly don't know. And actually, offsetting carbon is very often a bit of a greenwash. And we all need to be thinking, and I'm very glad that Assembly Member Hall has been raising this because you're actually sounding rather like a Green today. But seriously, we do need to be thinking how we can reduce the overall emissions, and that means reducing the amount of offsetting as well. And I think we do need to be tracking that and making sure that we are, that we are flying less and reducing the amount of offsetting that we end up needing to do.
Thank you. I think the points have been well made. And Assembly Member DeVal.
It does beg the question, and this is a question to you, Mary, about the history of the organisation and where different bits are. So, in your pre-meeting conversations, hopefully you would have touched on this, maybe, about what do you think has been the how has the transparency of trips made by the Mayor and the mayoral team changed over the history of the GLA? Did that come up in your conversation? Because I want to go back to the earlier point, whether it's greenwashing or not. I remember in previous administrations people talking about offsetting their carbon as being part of the deal when we've talked about travel abroad and when particular trips come up. So, and I'm surprised that some of the history of that hasn't carried forward. It may well be different contracts, may well be different ways of doing it as we get better at it or not, or we move away from greenwashing around that. So tell us about what's, what have you got historically about different ways things were recorded or not, or changes that have occurred?
So at the moment, Assemblymember Duval, not very much. We have focused, Ember, myself and others, on 2018 onwards for this committee. Gino, to be fair, I think did ask us, have you got anything before that? But we haven't been able to spend much time on pre-2018 at the moment. We've focused on 2018 onwards in preparation of the meeting. So we really haven't delved back into the past.
Assemblyman, just if you're interested, the one thing that I have been given is I do have a comparison list of international trips made by the current mayor, previous mayor, number of air miles, etc., how many were on Eurostar. So if the committee wants, if you want that, I can provide you with that information.
Well, we might need it written, but in terms of that, I want to go back to an earlier one, because one of the scandals in the previous administration was the mix match between mayoral staff using London and Partners and GLA and jumping between the two and not being as transparent as they should. Sorry, in answer to an earlier question, I think it was you, Phil, you gave me the impression that still might be the case, that we're not auditing, we're not collecting data, and that if you're part of the mayoral team or you're part of this organisation, you can rush off and do it under London and Partners, and it might not be as transparent as we want it to be. So is that still the case, or is that door being closed? Because that door should have been closed on this new administration. It should have been one of the lessons, or through the scrutinies that we'd carried out and raised with you as a particular concern. So where are we on this issue? I think just a very clear answer.
Yeah, so a very clear answer would be that if for instance, I were to be funded to travel by London and Partners, I never have been, but if I were, well then I think that would need to be declared as a gift and hospitality, because I don't have a relationship with them. If you are for instance, the Deputy Mayor for Business is the chair of London and Partners, and that is set out in his register of interests, and so you would thus expect him to travel as part of his responsibilities at London and Partners, and that's where the London and Partners disclosure regime would kick in. What I would say is actually Deputy Chief of Staff and I talked about this about a month or so ago, and we came to the conclusion that the existing policy of the authority, and it is an authority policy ultimately improved by Mary and by elected members, isn't as clear on this as we would like it to be, and so it is on the list of things for the next that I want to see in the next revision of this policy, is to just bring more clarity to that than historically we've had.
Well, let's not wait for a revision, because I think you can voluntarily do that from this meeting today to make sure there is transparency about those issues, because London and Partners is to an extent, 90% funded by us? And that's actually, as far as I'm concerned, that's a GLA body, whether it's separate or not, and we should be able to scrutinise what goes on there. And they have made changes, partly because the Accruery affair. They seem to have made them. We seem to have been catching up here. This is not really, and thank you for the way you answered the question, David, because I think you're clear. I'm now going back to Mary and Philip, right, because I'm not sure whether you officers are clear. So, one of the other little mini scandals was between the international section and London and Partners. Which bits of bodies were funded? Can you tell me that no longer goes on and that bit is transparent? Because I'm not clear from the answers you're giving me historically that I can't check from previous administrations to this administration that actually those changes have been made. I am embarrassed. I'm embarrassed by this authority, right, to be honest, because at this stage of the game, we should be able to deal with questions like offsetting carbon. We should be able to answer issues about things that we've learnt in the past that weren't working in the way they should have, to be honest, and that's about recording, data collection and being able to access it. And if we can't access it, there must be a big worry about where we're going. And I know we're dealing with it in the future, and I'm very grateful for it being in there. But actually, given the history of what went on in the past, we should be on top of this and closing some of these issues down, because they were in previous administrations. And given the Mayor's commitment about transparency, I want to be able to see that through in terms of this administration. So where are we on those issues that I've just raised?
I'm going to ask Phil to come in on L&P, because I think for staff, I think that is very clear. Just your point on learning from the past, Assembly Member Duval. So, you know, we haven't gone and interrogated expenses and flights and things like that pre-2018 for this meeting. But of course, the expenses and benefits framework is updated every 2 years, is formally approved by Mayor, Assembly and me. So, you know, I am confident that some of these lessons that you're talking about have indeed been learned and picked up in these reviews. Which I know that's not quite the point you're making, but that is the mechanism which we're actually saying, no, this is now the way we do this. David's alluded to, you know, I think there is still work to be done even now to make this even tighter. You're saying don't wait till April 24, and I agree with you, and we can do some earlier work on again, as I said, on some of the reflections we have had as a result of this meeting. Do you want to come in on L&P?
I mean, the simple answer on L&P is that L&P does not, certainly has not since I have been in the GLA, fund travel for GLA staff. And that's certainly the case within good growth. But when I've spoken to Laura Citron about this, she's been clear that it doesn't fund travel for GLA staff across the board.
I don't look.
Yeah.
I don't mind whether they fund it or not.
No, I appreciate that.
What I want is clarity, and I know that somewhere where we can go and we can see it. It's where it is. I'm not one, like many of these people around the table, do not, you know, there's one criticism around here which may not be mentioned by others, but are we doing enough of that overseas engagement for our staff, not particularly about politicians, but for our staff in terms of where it is? We can learn as much as they can learn from us, right? So I think there's an issue there. So I wouldn't want to get that lost in amongst everyone saying, oh, we shouldn't be doing this and we shouldn't be doing that. Because I suspect if we compare ourselves to, and it's a different organisation, the City of London does an amazing job for London and for this country. Now, I'm not comparing us in terms of the financial services, but, you know, they do use their trips in a way that benefits the economy and around that. And I think what we're trying to understand, and I think you can justify using your trips for the benefit of Londoners. And I think that's where we want to get. And they spend far more than anything you do.
I mean, I certainly agree that we can't...
We should be doing joint work with them, to be honest. That's the questions we should be saying about this
And
policy.
if I may say so, we are increasingly working with them jointly on that, because we have now set up and are funding the Opportunity London partnership, where we work with the City of London, with London Council and the boroughs to make sure that we are presenting a united front. So we are moving in that direction.
And also to add to that, when the international team are doing the research ahead of options for future mayoral trips, as well as talking to L&P and the various GLA teams one would expect, they also speak to the City of London Corporation, so we do have that join up.
Okay, right. I'm going to get into my formal questions now. In terms of justifying and perceptions, in terms of when you come to look at the future arrangements about justification and the issues, and you heard earlier on that the ones that you reject or don't reject, and maybe some of the issues, it will be interesting to see a list of some of the things that you do turn down, because I suspect it isn't just for environment, it's for actually time and capacity to go on some issues. But other people may have a different view whether you should turn it down. That might be the risk of it all. But in terms of that, what other ways do you think you can? Because I think there's an issue of us around this table understanding some of that need for international interaction. It can take place in many forms. But for the public to understand it, well, you've all got your noses in the trough. So what's the other issues in your considerations that you were thinking about? What could we also publish that would give some reassurance to the public about GLA trips, or, you know, in terms of international travel or even domestic travel? Have you given that any thought? The presentation of the staff.
So I would say, sort of reflecting again on looking at all of this material, in my role as Chief Officer, I haven't seen anything that's made me think, goodness gracious, why did so-and-so go on that trip? And you know, it's the first time I've looked hard at this information in the round. So I, because you know, everything falls into the categories that we've described through this meeting. So I don't think we have anything that we need to be worried about saying, actually, this is what we have done and why. Now, we choose not to at the moment. I think that's the point that you're making, Assembly Member Duval, and others have made, and we haven't really thought like that. Probably because, again, the point's been made that we think very carefully about how we spend this money, and in the grand scheme of things, not very much money is being spent. But there are, particularly on the GLA staff side, there are a few teams that are doing some travel for, as far as I'm concerned, the right reasons. Should we be sharing that more with Londoners and describing that work as part of pursuing Business for London, Profile for London, Learning for London? I think that's a good question. That's a good question, and that's a question that I think we need to ask ourselves coming out of this committee, because at the moment we choose not to do it. But from everything that I have seen in looking at what we have been doing over the past 4 or 5 years, I don't see that there's a reason why we shouldn't. But we don't currently do that.
Okay, right. Let's go to Emmenval in terms of my next question. So, over the years, and presumably you have interrogated some of the historical issues, has the GLA internal audit team ever raised concerns in regard of an application of GLA expenses regimes when claiming for trips? Has there been any issues internally where you would say, well, actually, there's been some questioning?
As you know, I've only been doing this particular role for a couple of weeks, so I did ask the internal auditors, and they said no. So that was one of the first things I've thought about as to what other issues are there, so that we can look at this holistically. We did put together the Agito information with the travel expenses information when we passed it over to committee services, so that you had all of it in one place. And as we've discussed at length, there are some gaps in the way that this could all be pulled together and presented in a single way that would help us analysed, but nothing's been brought to my attention yet about any concerns about any trips or anything untoward.
And you're not aware of anything historically?
I'm not. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been, but I have been focusing on this particular time period because that's what we got out of Egito. I haven't had the opportunity yet to go any further back, but because dealing with other issues as well. But at the moment, I haven't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. Mary, I just want to ask about the travel expenses within London. There's quite a few that we've seen in our brief that has destination of St Pancras Station and Euston, and they're quite expensive. So is there any consideration about how that costing is worked out? You know, are these particular trips from the home of that individual or from city or from work? You know, how do we make sure that this isn't something where somebody could have paid for themselves from their home destination like they would if they were going to work, for example? How do we make sure that that does not happen?
Well, so the expense and benefits framework is very clear in terms of what is claimable and not. And, you know, your point is generally the trip from home is not, but it depends on, and there's extraordinary detail in the expense and benefits framework about incremental costs or not from that. So the framework is very clear. When people submit their expenses, they need to justify what they're claiming for, and then according to the hierarchy laid out in the framework, those are signed off. So you know, those are the controls around that. I think you know, I don't sign off many because I don't get many claims. Phil probably signs off more than I do. And anybody signing off those is expected to ask the right questions before signing off. So those are the controls.
So who's asking those questions specifically?
Well, so I have to sign off expenses, Phil's expenses, for example. If I were to see something in the lines in Phil's expenses that I'm thinking, oh, that doesn't seem to fit to me with what I'm expecting, I would ask Phil.
So,
and I think, and
it just seems quite a lot of money. That's all I was kind of noticed.
Well, I think we'd have to look at the individual, to the individual case you're talking about to check. I'd be happy to do that, but broadly, it's very clear what people can and can't claim, and you know, people's travel patterns are very different as well, aren't they? So it may well be that for somebody, a trip up to St Pancras actually is an expense, whereas for somebody else it's not, because it would be contained in their general daily cost. That's all laid out in detail in the framework.
You said earlier that you've never refused any trip from the mayor. Has that been the case for deputy mayors as well?
I don't sign off for deputy mayors.
So who does that? That would be you, David.
So yeah, it's as set out in the policy that you've approved as an assembly member. So yeah, I would approve all international travel by people in the Mayor's Office Directorate, which would include deputy mayors.
Okay, great. So when we were looking through trips made by the Deputy Mayor for Business, there was a trip made to Delhi and Mumbai in November 2016, then he returned in September 2017. Sorry. Is it the mic again?
It is literally that. Yes.
Okay.
Apologies. I was sorry.
All right, okay. So just very then quickly on to another question then. That's fine. That's fine. So just very quickly on a trip in 2022 to 23, 4 people from the Communities and Skills went to Abu Dhabi at the cost of £5,600. How does that sit with the Mayor's ban on TfL advertising with the Emirates? Because I know that he had some concerns about that. And what exactly does the GLA staff have to learn from Abu Dhabi Excel when it comes to communities and skills? I don't mind if David or Mary answers that.
That's in the Communities and Skills Directorate, so we'd need to ask the relevant executive director about that trip. I'm entirely unaware of it.
I think we'll have to answer that separately. We can respond to that one.
So you'll find out why that trip happened, and why the fact that the Mayor has banned TfL advertising by the Emirates, we're still working with Abu Dhabi. That's the concern that I'm having.
No, I understand the question.
Yeah, that somebody having gone to Abu Dhabi, which you say is the case, of course, doesn't necessarily mean they were working with Abu Dhabi. We'd have to understand what the reason they were. It may have been a conference with people from other cities, for instance. So we'll have to look into the detail.
Thank you. And I know a couple of Assembly members want to come in, but I'm keen to move to Assembly Member Dr. Sahota before anybody takes the rest of the questions he may want to ask. So sorry I didn't pick up on that quicker, Onka.
Okay. My next question is to Enver, to you. Are you comfortable with the current arrangement for authorising international travel expenses claims, and do you think the arrangements should be reassessed?
I think there's a little bit of scope for improvement, and that's one of the things that we've already said that we're going to be looking at. I'm comfortable with the way our booking system works.
Mm-hmm.
I'm comfortable with the travel and expenses system. When there's a third party involved, I think we could do with a little bit more tightening up there.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. And David, in terms of international travel and the system for authorising trips, how does the current mayor, his deputies and political appointments compare to the system that you inherited in 2016?
So, I mean, if your question's quite a technical one about the systems, then I'm not well placed to comment because I don't use the systems. There are approval forms that are sent to the relevant approver as set out in the policy, and obviously they're then considered. As I indicated to Assembly Member Duval, I can talk a little about how international travel levels of the current and previous mayor have changed, but that's really all I have.
No, I'm really interested to know how the regime of authorising these trips, right, and how they happen, what you inherited and what we currently have. What improvements have you made, if any at all?
So it's all governed in terms of the policy, which, as I say, is a policy approved by the Mayor and Assembly and Chief Officer, and so the Assembly is cited, and that policy, I think it's fair to say, has evolved through the years rather than there being revolutionary change. The other side of it, of course, then is decision making within that policy about whether ultimately to undertake a particular trip or not. And clearly I'm not in a position to be able to talk about decision making in the Mayor's office under the previous Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much. It's building on what we were talking about with the train trips and actually some of the data, because the data we have in Appendix 4 gives us destination dates, and if you look at the Chief of destinations, if you look at the Chief Officer's Directorate, the majority of the trips listed are into London. The St Pancras one that was talked about, and I don't expect you to have the detail, but it was £156 for the 2 trips that were taken. So I think we're going to need more data on this to look at who it was who were travelling and where they were travelling from. But is there policy to say that there's a hub, i.e. there is a point from which everybody works and then the travel is taken from there?
So, I mean, I think on your first point, you'll see a lot in the data of people who've done day trips, say, to Birmingham or Manchester, and then the return journey clearly will be into Euston or St Pancras, places like that.
On that, the destination we wouldn't have the first part of the trip then, because if you look at Rail 22, 23, the reason I looked at Chief Officers Directorate is we've got Leeds, Liverpool, London, Euston, London, King's Cross and St Pancras. They're all destinations.
They'll be
We haven't got the
destination
original
for the return journey, won't they?
Yeah.
So can you just remind me your second point?
Is there a hub point?
Oh,
so if somebody is based at the Crystal City Hall, do we do the travel from there, or do we do it from their home location?
So it would, if somebody is, let's say somebody's going to Manchester for the day, yeah, well then the question would be how much of the trip is covered by, if they have, for instance, a season ticket or something like that, well then that will get them as far as London Bridge, for instance. Well then that has covered that cost, and the GLA would pick up the cost from London Bridge. Yeah, if they don't, or if they come to the office and are then subsequently going on the journey, well then we would pick up from where the trip starts.
So there isn't a hub point. It could start from their home location.
So yeah, if they're on one of these, out the door at 6:30 in the morning to get up to Manchester for a 9 a.m. conference or whatever it is, well then quite possibly you'd be buying a ticket from Bromley South to Manchester Piccadilly.
The reason I ask it, in the corporate world, you normally claim your mileage from your office. Is all, and it's your responsibility to get into your office.
We don't do mileage claims because we don't do cars. So it's.
I was using that as an example for rail claims. Same thing.
So it's about what ticket needs to be bought for the journey, and clearly, if somebody has a ticket already that would get them into central London to the mainline station, well, the GLA wouldn't need to pay for that because they've already paid for it, and we would buy the ticket from London Euston, London St Pancras, etc.
That's good. And that's a very important underpinning principle of the expenses and benefits framework. If it's already covered in your travel card or whatever it is, you do not claim again. You only claim for additional expenses.
I get that. No, the question was about, is there a hub point? No, there isn't. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Yeah, thank you. I've just been sort of looking through the Mayor's Register of Interest and Expenses reporting, so I just wanted to kind of understand a bit more about this, the trip to America with the £32,000 of flights that were being paid for by United Airlines following what was called a partnership agreement. Now, interestingly, the Mayor's hotel expenses for that May trip in 2022 are recorded properly in his expenses register. And so I then looked at the sort of gifts and hospitality, and there's another trip that year, the October trip, where travel and accommodation for the C40 Mayor's Summit was provided to the Mayor as chair of C40 cities, and there was about £11,000 of travel costs and £680 of hotel costs, which are rightly presented as gifts and hospitality. Now, the sort of principle of the gifts and hospitality policy is obviously you don't accept a gift or hospitality as an inducement or reward for anything you do at the GLA. So it's obviously right that the £32,000 for the United Airlines sponsored trip isn't registered as a gift and hospitality, but the partnership agreement isn't public, and we don't know what United Airlines got for that £32,000 of flight donations. And so I'm just wondering, where, in terms of the transparency, where that should be reported.
If I'm honest, say I'm not an expert on Assembly Member, but I really think you're possibly looking at this as something bigger than it is. I'm very happy. Let's set it all out in writing, and then if that raises issues about, well, should something have been published earlier, then obviously we can deal with that, and I'm very happy to. But I just I think let's just set out the facts clearly, because neither of us have them.
I think it's very important for transparency that those facts are set out.
I'm really happy to write publicly and do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to reiterate again, it's a shame we don't have those facts today. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. I've been looking at the data that we've been provided with on flights, and we, as the Assembly, have agreed that we will not fly to Paris, Brussels, destinations really easily reached on Eurostar in a matter of hours, and also destinations in mainland Britain as well, where alternative modes of transport are available. Because we believe that obviously going by train has a much lower carbon impact. And we just had a discussion where we didn't seem to be able to identify the carbon offsetting. I didn't quite understand what we eventually, where we came to on that. And I just wondered, because I'm looking through the list of all the international trips, and it's not very apparent to me in the data that we've been provided with how many of these were made by train. So, for example, there's a full list of all the trips made by the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, for example, from May 2016 to May 2019, and I assume there's trips that have been made post-pandemic as well. And there are a number of those trips that say Brussels, Paris, 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 Brussels, Brussels, all for reasons that we would completely understand, to do with air quality conferences, speaking to the European Commission, so on and so forth. Would it be possible to clarify for us whether all of these trips were all definitely made, particularly to Paris and Brussels, by train?
The tab that we sent, each spreadsheet had two tabs. One was for air, one was for rail. So if you look on the air one for each one,
this is just a list of international trips. On a separate page,
on a separate
I have separately, and it doesn't tell me who's made the trip.
Okay.
So those are the trips made by the Deputy Mayor.
The detail we've provided gave a spreadsheet for each year, and we split that between air and rail. And so if you opened the air sheet on each one, any trip that covers Brussels and Paris, if it's got air, that means someone's flown there. Otherwise, it's not. So we did provide that. The system that we use somehow defaulted Eurostar into the air category, so we actually did go through and manually move Eurostar from air into rail, because unless there's something about Eurostar I don't know, then it's not air.
Not usually, no.
No,
that would be quite an unusual way
because
to
of that,
haul
I was
it.
quite comfortable that the data that we'd given had been manually checked line by line for that reason.
Okay, and then if I go to the page where it talks about mayoral appointees trips by air, and there appear to be quite a lot of them at quite a lot of cost, and some of them are obviously ones that it would be more difficult to get there if you weren't flying. But then there are some, and I think Assemblymember Fortune was picking this up, it just says London Gatwick. Well, I mean, did someone fly from London City Airport to London Gatwick? That seems unlikely. So I assume that London Gatwick was the starting point for two people who went somewhere, but I can't see where. Then it says Luton. Did someone fly from Gatwick to Luton, or did someone leave from Luton to go somewhere? Then it says Stansted, likewise. I mean, it's not very clear. And then there's a list also under mayoral appointees trips air to Amsterdam, Berlin, Copenhagen, Glasgow, Rotterdam. I mean, some of those possibly much faster. For example, Copenhagen's quite difficult to get to, but they're all listed under air, and that includes going to Rotterdam and Amsterdam, which are really easy on the Eurostar. So, what's happened there? And I can go to, that's the mayoral appointees. Then I've got GLA officer trips by air from 2018-19, includes Edinburgh, the Isle of Man. I think those are both on the British mainland. I think we can agree that.
Isle of Man, we can't.
Perhaps the Isle of Man not, but definitely Edinburgh, unless it's been moved. And then I've got the same thing, the same problem. It says London City, London Gatwick, London Heathrow. That's the place where we started, not the place where we went to, I'm assuming. Edinburgh again, somebody went there. These are all lists. There's a very long list of flights in 2018-19, a very long list of GLA officer flights, air flights in 1920. One of them, ironically, says Brussels Midi Sud, which actually is definitely the train stations in Brussels, because I've been to them both. It seems strange that someone flew there. I'm just wondering why there appear to be so many flights when there are these alternatives. What's going on here?
So I think there's probably three things to say in response to that, Assembly Member. The first is I think you've given a brilliant exposition of why just data dumps and just throwing things out there can be misleading, because I'm sure that some of those things you've given, absolutely were train journeys to Brussels Midi South, as you say, and as I think was reflected earlier about the confusion about singles and returns, the way the data comes out of our travel system in its raw form, which we've given the committee, isn't necessarily very helpful to understand what actually has happened. And so, we need to think, if we're going to make any changes to the information we present publicly, how we ensure it is really clear, because otherwise it creates more questions than illumination for anybody. So that would be the first point. The second thing I would say in terms of the Mayor's office is that it's clear in the policy, it's not just a view of the Assembly, it's a view of the GLA, that wherever possible we will use trains for, Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Edinburgh, all places like that, and that is absolutely the policy. My policy when I receive FTA forms is, if they're not explicit that this is being done by train, and sometimes whoever administratively fills in the form just forgets to write that on it, I send it back for clarification. The third thing I would say, though, and I think the policy recognises this, is that there may very occasionally be exceptions. So I'm thinking, for instance, a conversation actually, somebody known to the Assembly member who doesn't work for the GLA group, so nothing to our business here, works elsewhere in the public sector, who, with the train strikes, etc., earlier this year, got stranded in Glasgow. And clearly in that sort of situation, their office was having to say, well, how can we get them home? And it may be that sometimes in situations like that, a flight ends up being the only thing that can be done. And we know we have had Eurostar strikes as well as strikes on the National Rail Network
so I think,
over the last year.
I think we would accept that there will always be exceptions, and you've just outlined a perfect example. Do we have a list of the kind of things that might mean that there would be an exception to the no-fly to the mainland and very easily accessible places in Europe? Do we have some sort of list of these might be the times when this would be an exception?
I don't think we do. I think people probably have sensible conversations, but we haven't got a list. That might be something else we need to consider.
I think part of the problem there is that obviously we try to book travel. Sometimes it has to be done at fairly short notice, but we try to book travel well in advance. I don't know about Eurostar, but clearly under UK law, unions have to give 2 weeks notice of strikes, and so in a lot of cases, well, we've booked the tickets already, and it become, you can then get into a relatively short notice. In the example I gave, well, nothing's been done through their travel system because it's been done as an absolute emergency. And obviously there are procedures with expenses that are incurred. So if somebody finds themselves stranded and they've got no choice but to get their own personal credit card out and pay for whatever it is, they'll then need to make an expense claim, and because it's outside policy, that ultimately will come to the CFO for sign-off, and I believe they're summarised and reported to audit panel.
I mean, I think what I would like to see, rather than going back into the sort of weeds of the report, is would you be able to tidy this up so that it makes more sense? Because I cannot believe that somebody flew to Bruxelles Midi Sud, because those are stations, and that would be a really weird thing for somebody to have done. Is it possible? And also the issue with the return travel and showing London Gatwick and someone coming back to Gatwick, which it clearly must be. So could we get something that actually makes sense rather than you yourselves called it a data dump, so I will just go in that direction too. I think it would be really helpful to have that. And also, would it be possible to establish a list of 4 examples where people might be forced, in inverted commas, to fly when there is the opportunity to take public transport that stays on the ground instead, because you know the difference in terms of the carbon impact and all of the rest of it, the environmental impacts, is really so dramatically more. I would really like us to have something quite sort of firm there as well. Would both of those things be possible?
So absolutely, we can look into that. Some of it, will need to change doubtless to systems and processes as well as how we report, but we should be able to do that, because the fundamental point about not flying for things that can be done by train is absolutely GLA policy. As I say, it's something as an approver I personally enforce. I absolutely would expect that all other approvers in the GLA do, because that's what the policy says and it's there for good reason.
Thank you. And just to come back to Enver, you said that we've got the tabs. The figures that I got for the Deputy Mayor for Business, Deputy Mayor for Energy Environment includes a sort of total in terms of the cash cost of the flights and train journeys that she made. I've got a long list of all of the international trips made by the Deputy Mayor for Business, May 2016 to March 2021, but there's no figure for how much all of those cost. And I think it was Assemblymember Hall who said she would fully expect the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor for Business and others to be sort of, if you like, selling London abroad. So I can see the nature of the trips that have been taken, but I would like to see how much they cost, because when we see the figures from the sort of gross value added from various other reports that might come to the Economy Committee or in London and Partners reports to their board, I think these kind of figures are useful in us assessing the input costs as well as seeing the outputs.
Yeah, I'll endeavour to try and get the cost of those. A lot of those were not funded by GLA, so I need to
okay, well in that case that would also be of interest. I think Assemblymember Russell has pursued the point about United Airlines, but it might be that there's a lot more sponsorship going on in here that we now can't see of other trips, possibly by other airlines or indeed other entities, and I think that would also be of interest, but not just to Assemblymember Russell, who's given me that look, but I think it might be of interest to a number of the Assembly members as to how these trips were being funded then, and I think transparency here would be of use. And finally, I just had a question about the rules determining the class of travel, and obviously there are some issues here where we were talking about please take the train rather than flying because of the lesser impact in terms of CO2. Of course, taking the train to Edinburgh rather than flying to Edinburgh is probably going to cost more, which is one of those ridiculous things that I just wish the government would get around to doing something about, any government of any complexion, but it's never been fixed. What are the current rules determining the class of travel? Economy class is only warranted for flights or train journeys of up to 3 hours. You might consider going first class or business class if you're flying for longer, because obviously if someone's got a packed schedule at the other end, if they've just flown for 12 hours to Singapore economy and haven't slept a wink, then that might not be the best, they might not arrive in the best shape. What are the decisions around that? What are the rules?
So the policy is set out in the framework approved by the Assembly. For rail, everybody should travel standard class except where non-standard class is cheaper, which occasionally randomly
it certainly
happens.
Does happen. Yeah. It's another one of those bizarre railway things.
I came up with my daughter on Friday and she was astounded by this, but it does sometimes happen. In terms of air travel, the GLA policy is flights up to 3 hours would be economy. For 3 to 6 hours in duration, premium economy permitted, 6 hours or over business. There's never first class for air travel.
Same question as I asked before. Are there exceptions made to that ever? And if there are exceptions, do we have a set of parameters that would guide when an exception might be made? Or do staff, if they want to, have the option to upgrade from premium economy to business class if their flight is 6 hours rather than, if it's on the cusp or something like that?
So I don't think the policy is crystal clear about. It doesn't really get into detail because we've probably talked about quite rare situations here. Clearly, this policy interacts with other policies where we consider staff's health and well-being. So there may be staff with particular medical conditions that mean that we have to, reflect that in how we apply the travel framework. But as a general case, we're not really in the business of giving exceptions and allowing people to upgrade, as it were.
Okay, but you've just mentioned another exception that is very valid if someone is travelling and has particular health conditions or needs, or indeed is travelling with a guide dog. We might make a number of different adjustments to allow them to travel. I'll leave it there, but thanks very much to all of you for your answers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. I just wanted to just clarify a couple of points that I was going to make earlier about the Deputy Mayor trips. Because there was trips that were made to Delhi and Mumbai so close together, do you think that in the future maybe you'll reconsider maybe not doing those types of trips when they are so close together in the future? David?
So I'm unclear which trips you're.
So this is the 2 trips in 2017, and there was November 2016, then September 2017. There were 2 trips in 2017 to South Asia, then back to a day trip in April 2019. There were lots and lots of trips back and forth, India and Pakistan, very close together in time.
So I'm not kind of quite seeing that. I find it hard to believe there was a day trip to India, and I'm not the details I'm looking at the moment don't reflect that at all. So
got it on April 2019. Maybe we can look into that further.
We were talking about earlier years. I don't see the April 2019. The Deputy Mayor was in Berlin, which is Germany, not India.
Okay, so maybe there's some lack of clarity there, because we're just looking at the facts that we've been given. So I can look back at my team and say, ask them to clarify this. But also there's trips to China as well that are, again, very close together. I'm just wondering whether the appropriateness of having these types of trips abroad, so in terms of time, whether they could have been done in just one-off trip, or there could have been more opportunities doing online business meetings instead.
So we absolutely would have to look at the justification for the specific trips. So there isn't really a general answer to that, but obviously each trip needs to be appropriately justified, as it would even if there was just one of them.
That's absolutely right. I don't know the detail of all of those trips. I'm aware of the trips that were undertaken to China, and that was the Deputy Mayor accompanying groups of businesses going out through the Mayor's International Business Programme. So effectively the timing of those trips was sort of reflected the cohorts going through the Mayor's International Business Programme, and the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor was accompanying those. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that there may be scope to look at doing two cohorts at once or something like that. But I think it is important to say, though, it was driven by the needs of the investment programmes that were being run, rather than by the needs of the Deputy Mayor's schedule.
Right, and I just want to thank also for the earlier answer about the funding of the Knight Zars trip to Australia being, you said South West Wales government, was it? Yes.
No, the government of New South Wales.
Right. Okay.
The state government.
So not GLA funded.
So not GLA funded.
And that's great to know, because I asked specifically 11 questions on this and not one of them were answered, and it would have been brilliant to have had those answers beforehand. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're having this meeting today, is that when we ask these questions, they're not answered, and we're having to do meetings like this. And it's such a shame, because I asked all of these questions before. Will those questions now be answered? I mean, it helps Night's R, because she doesn't want to have negative press either. If those questions are answered earlier, we wouldn't be in this situation. Will those questions be answered soon?
Well, I mean, all mayoral questions will be answered. I'm not cited on those specific ones. We try to answer questions as quickly as we can. Sometimes there are rather a lot of them, and we get to it as quickly as we can. Yeah, I don't know whether I'm going to be asked to clear the answers to those, but if so, it hasn't reached me yet, so I didn't know those questions existed. But I will ask colleagues about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Mark Drakeford would probably appreciate if we clarify that we mean not New South Wales, the Australian territory with Sydney in it, not Wales. But any more for any more? Maybe we can clarify with him. I can't see anyone else. I just one more thing for me, David. I mean, we're clearly going to be looking into this carbon offset thing. So I just want to add, if we could get a steer on the Mayor's preferred method of carbon offset, that would actually be really appreciated, because I'd like to know, and I'm sure the committee would, what is his preferred method for carbon offset.
Yeah. So I mean, there's clearly a policy view on that, as well as what specifically the GLA does, so we can happily settle that out.
Thank you. So in that case, I'd like to thank the panel for coming today and for your answers in this session. We're going to deal with a few further items, and while they will be very intriguing, you are also free to leave if you'd like. Apart from Mary, yeah. I think Mary knows that.
Chair. Yes. Chair, I was going to stay for the item on planning and regeneration, given that that's within my directorate.
Thank you. And so thank you, David and Ember. Right, moving on to the proposed... Are we expecting anyone else? So moving on to the proposed changes to the GLA establishment for planning and regeneration, we'd like to welcome Lucinda Turner, the Assistant Director for Planning and Regeneration, joining Philip and Mary for this item. I've had indications from Assemblymember Hall.
Mary, you will remember a couple of leaders meetings before, and I double-checked with a couple of my colleagues, that we looked at Simon Grinter brought a proposal to you with many members of staff going up some grades, and we were concerned about this, and you actually said that you were not going to be doing that again before the pay and grading review. There was going to be no more movement for moving people up grades before you actually sorted that out, didn't you?
So I certainly talked about the very few restructures we were going to complete before the pay and grading review.
No, you said there weren't going to be any more. You said that was the only one, and you gave specific reasons for that particular one.
For the FM one, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you said there weren't going to be any more.
I remember talking about this. I can't remember. I'm going to have to ask Phil. So we've always... So yes, you're right. We have said there's a cut-off now in terms of considering restructures before the pay and grading review work is done and before the job families work is done. This is a slightly unusual one because it straddles GLA and TfL. And has been going on for some time. Phil is probably going to say that this is one that is also going to get under the wire before the pay and grading review.
Well, you told us nothing was going to go under the wire before the pay and grading review. You told us that the last one was special and took great lengths to tell us why it was special, and that nothing else was going to happen before this very long-awaited pay and grading review, didn't you?
Well, yes, we were talking about the Assembly scrutiny, Assembly Secretariat scrutiny, which has gone through. We were talking in a private meeting about the facilities management.
Yes, but whether
one,
but which is why I'm not going into detail about that specific one. Except we were told that nothing else was going to be moved.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But to be honest, Assembly Member Hall, I can't remember the time. This has been.
I can, and I can remember that because I was quite irritated at the time.
Yes, what you're not letting me finish is that I can't remember at the time whether I had remembered that this regeneration and planning restructure was underway. So this has been going for a very long time, and Phil and Lucinda are here to talk about it. You are right that I did say that there aren't going to be any more. This one, however, was underway. I can't remember whether I remembered about this one or not. You're saying I didn't, and I accept that if that's what you remember. But there are a tiny, tiny number of restructures still going through. The FM one is still to come to this committee. The Assembly Secretariat one has now gone through, and we are recruiting 2. This, I think, is probably the very final one.
I think that's what we were told last time.
I need to ask the committee to listen to what Lucinda and Phil have to say.
Well, yeah, but then what's the point of us having meetings and being assured of things, only to find that something else happens? You know, what is the point of you saying there's a very special reason for this, and we went through that particular one at detail, and I won't go into that now because it was a meeting, but it is somewhat annoying when we're told that this is it now, and then it's a proper brand grading review, and then we see this.
Well, then I accept responsibility for that. You know, in different meetings, I'm having different conversations. I had failed to remember that this one was still on the stocks.
But if you're telling the leaders that something has happened and then we find out that it hasn't happened, that is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to tell us that this is the very last one and there was a special reason for it, at which point we had a discussion and apparently it was going through, and then we see this.
Yeah, well, this should have come to previous meetings. Hasn't come to previous meetings. It's here now. I clearly, in the moment of that meeting, didn't remember that this was still underway.
So we can't rely then on what we're being told, can we?
Well, I think Assembly Member Hall, you can 99% rely on what I tell you. Well, I failed to remember in that meeting that this one was still underway, for which I apologise.
I think we've cleared that. Thanks. Well, I think we are where we are with that. Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions on the proposal. One is slightly related to Assembly Member Hall's question, in that obviously I'm not party to discussions about what's coming up at that level. Although I would say that pay and grading reviews can sometimes take quite a long time, so you may or may not be able to freeze everything for long periods of time. But there are a couple of posts that are being upgraded very shortly before a pay and grading review, and seemingly simply to bring them in line with another role in another department because you're bringing 2 together. That seems to be a little bit premature, given that you don't know whether the pay and grading review will agree that they should be at this grade or that grade, and so could be a little bit of grade inflation there where everyone just gets shoved up a little bit just before a grading review. So just wanted to sort of clarify why that particular decision had been made.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask Lucinda and Phil now to cover the detail, but you know, but those points are exactly why we have said there are a tiny number now being completed before we before we bring down the
I mean,
guillotine.
I'm not
But
really...
over to
Yeah,
you, Lucinda.
but can I ask my other question then, because it's also about the detail, maybe you just want to then wrap up it all. Sorry, I didn't know whether you were going to explain before. But just to say, it's less that I think that nothing should happen. It's just a question of, did you need to put them up a grade if actually what you could do is say, well, you're going to get a pay and grading review, and if it comes out that actually you're going to be up a grade, then you'll get backdated, which I'm assuming is part of the role. And the other thing that I wanted to ask about was your matrix structure. I've read the paper a couple of times. I'm afraid my ability to interpret management speak is getting a little bit rusty, but I am familiar with matrix structures. And in my experience, they only really work when people are working on very, very time-limited, dedicated projects, normally external projects, actually, because that really sort of makes the rationale for having two different management, line management, or two different management structures. Really, my management speak is very rusty. That's the only real way it works. Otherwise, it can just be very, very confusing. I couldn't see any more detail. I appreciate it's not our role to go through to that level of that degree, but I'm just a little bit worried about that. And so I don't know whether you can talk us through a bit more about that. Yep.
Thank you. Is that on?
Yes.
Yeah. Just in terms of the first question, it wasn't just to align when we were moving people into the same teams. It was also in recognition of the kind of strategic nature of the roles. And we didn't, you will note that I did set out in the paper that we didn't do wider alignment for exactly the reason Mary said, that there was a kind of wider moratorium, but these specific roles that we proposed for the regrading were those most directly impacted and literally moving to sit alongside kind of colleagues doing the same strategic nature of the role. So that's why these very few were proposed, but we have left the others and made it clear that it will be subject to pay and reward review. We have also made clear to staff that this isn't set in stone, that pay and reward review is coming, and there will inevitably be wider changes in that, etc., and we will need to align to those. In terms of the matrix structure,
can I just come in there just on that? But the paper just does say addresses inconsistencies, and the description you've given is just that you've said we have to put them up because they're working alongside another role that is at that grade. And if you put them up at the grade, I'm assuming they will have pay protection, and so even if they are taken back down, that then is an additional cost. So I understand that this will go through a process, and I don't really want to work the detail on it, but it doesn't seem to be very sort of future-proofed, considering that something is coming up, because of course, I'm assuming there will be a backdating agreement about if actually people go up, and then a protection agreement if people go down.
In paragraph 6.19, it does reference and talk about the specific and significant strategic responsibilities associated with the roles.
But isn't that a job evaluation issue that would come up in job evaluation and job pay and grading?
And these will be going through job evaluation.
Okay, I'm not going to go round and round and round, but I don't think you've answered the question, I'm sorry.
In relation to matrix structure, there is a kind of broader, quite complicated map that shows the kind of TFL and GLA kind of matrix structure. You can't do single line management across the organisational boundaries. So the line management will be to two people, but actually day to day, the work and the management of the work and the coordination will be through those single kind of area leads. So I think it can work. We've been moving towards it kind of in day-to-day activities. We've done it on things like levelling up fund bids. We've done it in work on particular places like Old Kent Road. I think it works pretty well, but actually formalising it slightly more will make it work even better.
So just to clarify, this isn't driven by the needs of the work, it's driven by the facts on the ground, which is there are people working for two different organisations working on the same work.
Well, it's driven by the work in terms of trying to integrate the activities
across
as it stands at the moment. there isn't a way of kind of merging the teams. And in any event, because there are particular still responsibilities on the TfL side, for example, as Highways Authority, etc., you still do need some kind of structures over there. This is kind of from, I've been doing the kind of dual role for kind of over kind of 2 and a bit years now. This reflects the best way we think there is of working in particular places and bringing together the expertise across planning, regeneration and transport. And in all the conversations I have with boroughs, both officers, councillors, etc., they have called out for this and for us to organise ourselves along these lines.
And I think there is a apologies. I will let you come back in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I appreciate that, and there's obviously complexities of the organisation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the best way of actually managing people, and that there will be some inefficiencies around that. So I just think that's worth sort of thinking about. You know, we have multiple organisations. It is going to be complicated, but I don't think sort of saying matrix management that therefore is wonderful and perfect is necessarily the way to go.
I appreciate that, and there are trade-offs to be made. I mean, the only very small point I was going to make, just in addition to what Lucinda has said, is that this is an unusual matrix arrangement in that we have Lucinda herself in the dual role. So whereas there are sort of structures within teams that span the two organisations at the top, there is, for want of a better way of putting it, a single controlling mind. So I think it will be easier to manage those tensions. That doesn't mean that they won't take some management, if I could put it that way. In terms of the grading point that you make, again, I mean, I take your point, and I accept that there is a tension here. There is the point that you make about pay protection and the sort of fact that this is happening close to an ongoing pay and grading review, or the implementation of that. However, there are real sort of working environment challenges of people in a single team doing pretty much exactly the same job, being clearly and visibly at different levels within the organisation. We have, exactly as Lucinda has said, there are a whole set of people who would have liked this process to have addressed concerns or looked at concerns that they felt, who we have said, I'm sorry, we can't do that, this is coming up. But there is this very small set of roles where we think that disparity is going to be so clear, and where they have that kind of strategic role within the team, that our judgment was it was worth making the case for an early change at this stage. But having, I mean, notwithstanding the payment protection point, which I accept, having been very clear with those individuals that doesn't fetter the discretion of what comes out of the pay and grading review.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Understood. Although I would just like to note that it seems that the money's being thrown to the people at the top, who might feel that they'd be undervalued, rather than anyone else. And back to the chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. I did want to talk a little bit about what Assembly Member Baker was saying, but I just want some clarity. That within this merger, there's going to be the new place unit and the new design unit that's still different. Can I have some clarity on that, and why are they separate?
So they will sit alongside each other. The design unit will provide design advice, expertise, manage a good growth by design programme, provide design advice for development management colleagues who sit alongside as well. Basically, the design unit is looking kind of 360 degrees. It's providing a service not just within planning and regeneration, not just within the GLA, but more broadly as well. They will be working hand in hand with people in the place unit. They'll be working hand in hand with people in development management. They'll be working hand in hand with people in housing and land as well. The place unit is bringing together those planning, regeneration and transport activities that are place kind of focused. So when we're working in Old Kent Road, when we're working in Royal Docks, when we're working in kind of Barnet, when we're working in that's those activities. So the design unit kind of covers pan-London advice kind of application, as well as kind of they will get involved in those particular places as well. But it just made sense in my mind to have them sitting alongside each other.
And just in terms of next steps and can maybe considerations that you've already made, was there any discussion about the GLA team for development management, the TfL team for spatial planning? Were they involved in any of your thinking?
So they've been absolutely involved, and we've been doing kind of a lot of work. As Mary said, it has taken longer than I had hoped, but alongside this, we've been doing a lot of work on processes and shared processes and systems, etc. So on the development management side, I have a team in TfL who deal with regulatory planning and responding to planning applications, and the development management team in GLA. They have separate statutory responsibilities. TfL is the Highways Authority. So we did at the early stage think, is this a shared service, is it not? We thought actually in kind of some areas it makes sense to not bring them together, but to look at the process and systems. So through this past kind of couple of years, we've implemented a shared back office system now for those teams for planning applications. So the TfL and GLA team can all access it. We used to have to do sharing of materials over WeTransfer. Took a long time. There wasn't the coordination in terms of case officers meeting up, kind of joining together. We have shared pre-application meetings so that applicants and boroughs get a kind of joined up view rather than separate meetings. So there's been a lot of work, across all the different teams, but there's different solutions according to kind of the place-based work is where it felt it made most sense to integrate it more.
You've avoided duplication, that's my main point then. Okay, great, thank you.
Assembly Member Hall.
Yes, can we just very briefly go through these so you can tell me how many people report to them? So, new head of design unit, how many people report back to that person?
It will be about 10 people.
10. And the strategic planning manager?
Directly, it will be 3. But they will work across all the different areas, so they will need to take a lead role in the kind of management and the planning, kind of technical assurance of all the work done across that place unit.
3. And regrade as strategic planning manager?
They will have, that's about 28 people in total, okay. So probably half and half, 14 each.
And new area manager lead?
That is to be decided. We're looking at how to align the people in the teams, but in the matrix teams, probably about 8 people.
And the last one, spatial planning.
Oh, sorry, that's the one that's the planning manager. Sorry, what was the second one?
I just want to know how many direct reports they've got to them.
Yeah, I think I've mixed that one up with the answer I gave earlier. That's the one that has kind of about 3 people, but will be working across all the area teams.
Okay. So going back to the regrade of the strategic planning manager, because at one point we had, as you know, Mary, so many managers managing one person, and you said how utterly ridiculous it was.
So the second, there are 2 strategic planning managers. They're the ones who have the total team of 28, but split between them, so it's about 14 each.
So they're both 14. Okay, at least we're not down to the 1 or 2s. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we certainly have a lot to pick up I think, on this one and communicate back to the team, which we will do. So the committee's recommended to respond to the Chief Officer's consultation on the proposed changes to the GLA establishment relating to the restructure of the current planning and regeneration unit, which I believe we will be doing and feeding back that discussion. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today, Philip. And now, if you do want to leave, I think you can as well, can't you? And Lucinda. And is Michelle?
Yeah, Michelle's online.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I'd like to welcome Michelle Kumabora, Assistant Director for Skills and Employment, who's joined this meeting on Zoom and will be joining the Chief Officer for this item. I've got an indication from Assembly Member McCartney.
Yes, thank you. The reason for this restructure is to establish or improve an assurance function, and that came out of recommendations made in an AEB MOPAC audit. But there was no detail in the papers as to what those recommendations actually were that necessitated the change. So could you just briefly outline what were the issues highlighted and why this structure addresses them?
So apologies, I don't have the report in front of me, but from memory it was far more about strengthening some of the compliance and assurance activity taken across all of our programmes. So when the unit was initially established, I think in this paper it sets out we had 52 individuals. It was just looking after the adult education budget. The team have now taken on a range of different externally funded programmes as well, which has necessitated a larger team. What that does mean is that there needs to be greater assurance across all of those programmes than we had initially planned when it was just looking at the adult education budget. And some of the recommendations in the audit report indicated that we should take a stronger role in some of those areas. And this team is, or the proposal for this team is a reflection of that. But I can certainly send on the audit recommendations to you afterwards. Apologies, I don't have them in front of me.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think one of the difficulties is that we don't have in the papers a diagram of the current structure to be able to compare it to the new structure. So I think, Mary, perhaps going forward, when we're looking at these restructures, we could have copies of the old structure and the new structure so we can compare. But can I ask, there is the 2 roles proposed for deletion. What's the current status of those? Are they vacant or are those people in post?
So they have, so actually I'll answer your first question because it relates to this. Yeah. So when you look at the existing kind of compliance team within the unit, that is 1 individual. And that is the grade 11 we are proposing to delete and then recreate sort of more of an insurance role with a grade 11 heading that up. So it's a sort of deletion of 1 post and a creation of another post to have a wider remit around assurance in that sense. That post has somebody in it, but obviously there is a like-for-like job should they be successful to go into that one. The grade 13 also has an individual in post, however that is a slightly different reason for the deletion of that post in the sense that when the unit was initially set up we had a lot of requirements from government around the adult education budget and the governance associated with that. Effectively that role was created initially to set up all of the governance processes across the unit. All of those have now been set up and there's no longer the need for a senior member of staff to deliver all of that as these structures are now fairly well embedded and government are happy with all of those, as are the various audits that we've gone through in place. So there is a deletion of that senior level role because of the change in scope of the activity.
Okay, thank you. And my final question then is the paper states that the European Social Fund is currently a source of funding for the team. What happens when that funding stops?
So partially our current compliance manager is funded by European social funding or partly funded by European social funding, and that's because their current role looks at European programmes. The proposal around this is that the assurance manager will cover a much wider remit of programmes, so therefore they will be funded by the adult education budget, multiplied boot camps and other external revenue streams that function would oversee.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
My question's already been asked. That's fine.
Excellent. Don't see any other questions. So in that case, the committee is recommended to respond to the Chief Officer's consultation on the proposed changes to the GLA establishment relating to the changes to the Skills and Employment Unit, which we'll do. And Michelle, you're free to leave us if you'd like. And Mary as well, though we should just be a couple of seconds, so you might as well. Wait. In relation to the GLA Oversight Committee work programme, can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 2023-24? Thank you. And the date of the next meeting committee meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday the 12th of July at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.